My name is Frank Burke. I've devoted much of my writing to Fellini over the past 40 years, a testament to my great love for his work. Roma is my favorite Fellini film, so I'm delighted to share it with you in this beautifully restored version. The film was released in 1972. It was produced by Turi Vasili's Ultra Films with distribution money from United Artists and Ital Noleggio and further aid from the Banca Nazionale del Lavoro. The film emerges in the middle part of Fellini's career when his reputation, especially in North America, was at a peak. It was not a huge box office success and received mixed critical reviews, though important figures such as Roger Ebert strongly praised it. It has come to be the preferred Fellini film among many artists and intellectuals. The film's writer was Bernardino Zapponi, who began working with Fellini in 1968 on Toby Dammit. A fan of lowbrow literature, with a particular interest in horror and psychological abnormality, he confirmed Fellini's orientation as a cartoonist toward popular rather than high culture. I will underscore the film's most obviously pleasurable aspects, its visual power and inventiveness, its unique and loving characterizations, its variety in tone, subject matter, and approach, its musical richness, its capacity to surprise and astonish. But I will also address its formal originality and experimentation, its thematic sophistication, its openness in terms of structure and meaning, and its commitment to movement and change versus the permanence and monumentality that Rome as eternal city threatens to impose. Fellini himself has become a monument at this point in his career, so he makes a bit of fun of himself as an author in the course of the movie. The film originated not as a script, but as 6 sketchbooks depicting different sequences, and Fellini envisioned filming episodically over the course of a year. So this is not conceived as a film with tight narrative progression. Also, though there's a clear element of autobiography, it is qualified. The young boy of the first scenes and the young adult of later scenes are never explicitly tied to each other or to the adult Fellini we see in the present. There are discrepancies between the young adult's representation and Fellini's early years in Rome, though the former does sport a hat reminiscent of the sort Fellini wore. And the narrator or eye of the story is not Fellini, but a Neapolitan actor, impressionist, and movie dubber, Alighiero Noschese. There may be practical reasons for this. Fellini's voice is high-pitched and even a bit comical. But in this film of attenuated autobiography and authorship, I like to think there is an aesthetic reason as well. The opening seconds of the film, set in the provinces, give us important associations. The darkness and the scythe suggest death or endings. The reference to America, a desire to emigrate from the small town. The kilometer marker introduces Rome as a destination. The fixedness of the rock is counteracted by the movement of the bikes, monument versus motion, which will become a crucial contrast in the film. Gravitation toward Rome is accentuated in the school trip by the headmaster's reenactment of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. All the children are dressed the same and forced to act identically, suggesting the authoritarianism and conformity that will promote a desire to escape on the part of at least one of them. The celebration of Caesar in this context is also a celebration of fascist ideals around dictatorship and the Roman Empire. The bandaged foot and tentativeness of the headmaster in conquering such a minimal obstacle as this small stream imply the restricted mobility and by extension limited options of life in the provinces. Caesar as a Roman authority or monument is undercut by the absurdity of the reenactment, but even more so by a statue in which Caesar has lost half his head and a good deal of his hand and is being mocked in verse by the town zany. This politically oppositional voice, protected by his marginality, links Caesar to Mussolini with sexual insults, introducing sexuality and transgression as weapons against power. In terms of sexuality and power, we're not sure from the cross-cutting if the children are looking at the statue or at the attractive woman with the prominent bum singing in the window. Caesar is subject to further derision by the over-the-top theater production of Julius Caesar and the distinctly unsoldierly actor who plays him. In this, his third appearance in the film, Caesar is assassinated. Theater and entertainment, and even crude entertainment such as we have here, will be an important part of the film's representation of Rome and even of Fellini's own filmmaking as the movie continues. Following this scene, we move to another of the small communities, having seen the class outing, the town square, and the theater, and Fellini's presentation of provincial life. The bar scene is static, which, though negative in some respects, provides a sense of stress-free sociability. The customers comprise another in a series of passive audiences that, with the exception of the piazza poet, characterize the provinces. Again, Julius Caesar has to compete with a woman as a ludicrously lascivious customer ogles the cashier instead of paying homage to the great actor. The school sequences feature a repressive environment and links between fascism and Rome. But in each, there is a momentary breakout. We see a cross and portraits of the king and Mussolini on the wall, and the female assistant reduced to the headmaster's spy. However, the story of the geese of the Capitoline directs the students' attention to Rome as an outlet. Moreover, they disregard classroom protocol and charge toward the window, becoming the first active audience in the film. Here we see one of Fellini's favorite motifs, especially in Roma and in Amarcord, though also in 8½. We see heads bandaged, covered, repeatedly banged and smacked, signifying a remorseless assault on intelligence and creative thought on the part of the educational system. The second school sequence presents a more organized image of institutional control, still with the same headmaster, but with somewhat older children, now in uniform, and better behaved than the earlier group. Military discipline has joined Catholic and school discipline and seems to be working at taming the children as compliant social subjects. The sequence offers a form of complex gender initiation in relation to Rome, beginning by associating the city with the she-wolf that supposedly suckled Romulus and Remus. It also introduces the students to projection, technological and psychological, paving the way for the later sequence at a provincial movie theater. The slideshow begins as a fascist and Catholic-oriented celebration of Roman myths and monuments, and the children initially serve as another passive audience. At the sight of the altar of the fatherland, they all duly applaud. However, the shocking appearance of a semi-nude woman becomes mythic and monumental unto itself. The moment seems transgressive, but Fellini presents it as institutionally contained. When the image appears, the camera zooms in on the young child who reacts by grinning and jumping up and down, but only after he's been framed in close-up. It is as though the camera has positioned itself for the expected response, which it then automatically receives. Then the entire group reacts in exactly the same way with the same unanimity that greeted the altar of the fatherland. Throughout Roma, we see Fellini's skill in creating multiple environments with precise sketches of colorful characters and humorous moments. The family scene is a perfect example. Sound is particularly important in suggesting the mayhem that can circulate around the dining room table, and a scene that will be reprised with greater hilarity in Amarcord. Conflicting perspectives abound. The piety of the older women confronts the anti-clericalism of the childish father, who in turn is rebelling against the dictatorial voice of the radio. The young maid cannot contain herself, and though her time is brief in the film, in this and the following scene she presents a subtle alternative rooted largely in class to what goes on around her. The cinema sequence begins with someone appearing to remove a cloth from the camera eyes, suggesting how our vision is controlled at and by the movies. The child is still wearing a uniform, his sailor suit, but is also developing a more active eye. As he turns around, the camera follows his gaze rather than containing it, as happened at school. His emerging consciousness will be crucial to the sequence. Spectators surrender to the film experience is comically implied as family members strain their necks to compensate for the distortion of the image as they watch from way off to the side. The movie presents the emergence of Christianity within a decadent Roman Empire, coupled with a love story in which a Roman renounces his ties to the old order to be with the beautiful Christian Priscilla. The play with music and sound here is extraordinary, as Richard Dyer points out in his excellent book on Nino Rota. What should, according to genre, be a silent film is not silent, and the music suits at times the film and at times the hubbub in the audience. The orthodox tale of Christianity triumphing over a brutal and inhumane society is qualified in a couple of ways. Priscilla, as we will see in a second, looks not like a diva of her era, but a 1960s, 1970s hippie. So this 1930-ish film becomes contaminated with contemporary free love or love the one you're with intimations. And repeated instances of incivility in the audience contest any notion that a kinder, gentler Christian society has replaced Roman crudeness in Italy. The swelling tones of a musical theme from Fellini's The White Sheik, the story of a young woman's infatuation with a star of photo novels, provides commentary on the mawkish romanticism of this spectacle. The director's representation of an overly suggestible provincial audience becomes comic because they have become thoroughly attached to the film, having entered midway through. The maid, however, again provides an alternative response, grinning while everyone else is overcome with sentiment. One instance of incivility, the clash between the headmaster and another movie patron, gives birth to the first instance of imaginative activity within the film, as there is a rapid crosscut from the scuffle to a poster of King Kong. We are treated to a brilliant parody of a fascist propaganda newsreel. The tumult of the theater environment, the stimulation of movies, and possibly the testosterone, though not the message of the fascist film, excite the active eye of the boy. But he seems to need the initial mediation of the maid, who is gazing upon the provocative figure of the pharmacist's wife when the boy follows suit. He smiles at her with a kind of innocent child smile, and then he indulges in a fantasy that has far more to do with power and empowerment than with sex. The opposite of the romantic Christian Priscilla, she is described as worse than Messalina. Authoritative, autonomous, and uninhibited, she controls the men around her and ultimately ignores them in a frenzy of self-expression. She is other and transgressive, as was the figure in the slideshow, but the child's experience of these qualities is far less contained than it was earlier, and is in part the product of his imagination. One other quality she is associated with is immobility. She operates out of a parked car, and Fellini's representations of women will tend to suggest stasis. Women seated or as seats, that is derrieres, in the slideshow, confirms the connection, but as the attitude of the know-it-all in the bar here makes clear, this is not about women, but about how men choose to see them. At the train station, along with the usual provincial inactivity near the tracks, we see among the children what we might designate as three different relationships to the possibility of exiting the provinces. There are the boys who come to the station but continue to play soccer while the international train arrives and departs. The two children who approach the railing with a third but stay behind it. And then our hero who pulls himself up and frees himself to look over the railing unimpeded at the train. The departure of the train and his accompanying eye propel us directly into the next section of the film, the arrival in Rome. Returning a moment to the issue of autobiography, for the U.S. release of Roma, United Artists asked Fellini for voiceover that served to tie the young boy of the provinces and the young adult in Rome to him. Happily, we are back to an Italian-based version, in which autobiography remains more a possibility than a reality, consistent with the ways in which Fellini loosens narrative and cinematic form. Fellini creates significant distance between himself and the young adult. The latter is played by an American actor, Peter Gonzalez, with distinctly American mannerisms that help convey his out-of-placeness in Rome. Judging from the advertisement we see shortly for the 1940 film Grandi Magazzini, the youth arrives in Rome at least a year after Fellini did, and in the summer, whereas Fellini arrived in the winter. By the Barafonda theater sequence, July 1943, when the young man has an encounter with a German woman, Fellini was 3 months shy of marriage to Giulietta Messina, not single. Unlike Fellini, the youth never seems to work. The dark-haired woman to whom the young adult is drawn will be the first of several such figures in the film. In addition to her sexual appeal, she seems to reflect the youth's desire to be sought out, cared for, having arrived alone in the big city. The shift from child to young adult constitutes not the psychological development of a single personality that we have seen in earlier Fellini films, but more generalized stages of life and desire. For the child, the emphasis was on escape, freedom, transgression, empowerment. For the young adult, a desire for belonging is accompanied by a wish for exploration and adventure, partly but not entirely sexual and romantic. Anticipating the conclusion of the film, the young man's trip from the station to his lodgings, roughly from his point of view on a tram, initiates 2 minutes and 40 seconds in which there is not a single static moment on screen. The monumental architecture of the city is mobilized, suggesting a world fully alive to its new inhabitant. We have seen a host of uniforms that convey a world of proliferating institutions. The young man, too, wears a uniform, the pristine bourgeois white suit, which sets him apart, as does the fact that he is a civilian in a world obviously at war. Similarly, the social world he enters is dynamic. Adults moving and complaining, children playing in the streets, a woman singing as she vigorously beats a carpet, able to take a great deal of pleasure in her work. People appearing and disappearing in doorways as the young man seeks the family with which he will be staying. More children, and again we see a child's bandaged head under assault, though not this time in the context of school. As the youth moves toward his pensione, we get an interesting glimpse into the logic of the film. He allows himself to be distracted by something more immediate, by a conversation happening in the hallway. This leads him to a window where he explores what's outside rather than closing himself in. This is the first of many instances in the film in which movements inside or inward will be thwarted, and goals will be altered, and in some cases even abandoned, in a world in which linear activity is often neither possible nor desirable. In the course of his first day in Rome, the young man will enter and be guided through the boarding house, but a far greater portion of the day will take place in the more open environment of the street. Even here he gets cornered at a table, but as we end the evening, we are taken beyond the confines of the street and the Roman center to more open spaces in front of St. John Lateran, and then to the Appian Way. As the youth moves into the apartment, we're struck by the narrowness of the space and the distances and doors and rooms that separate people. On the other hand, there continues to be a great deal of activity, much of it conveyed through audio that opens us out to people and places off-screen. There's a strong sense of welcoming, some of it grounded in sexual attraction, such as Antoinette the maid, who clearly feels quite attracted to our hero. There are no secrets in this world, as Antoinette feels free to discuss inflamed ovaries with her new acquaintance. There is an extraordinary range of generations from babies to the elderly, almost compressing the variety of an entire provincial town into the space of one Roman boarding house. The son of the proprietress recalls Fellini's I Vitelloni, a story about mamismo, grown men who never leave home. Fellini is tempted to talk of Rome as a mother, recall the she-wolf from the slideshow, and our young man is the object of a good deal of female nurturing in the film. However, this bedridden, sunburned ne'er-do-well, with a hairnet that suggests yet again a constriction of the head and mind, clearly reflects maternal domination and consequent infantilism rather than a healthy mother-child relationship. But even he is welcoming, even if on a somewhat superficial level, complimenting the new border on his shirt. Racism meets internationalism as Antoinetta introduces the young man to a Chinese tenant who is taken to cooking with an enormous flame in his room. Amidst her aggressive recriminations, he is a picture of both welcoming and assimilation, offering the young man not Chinese food, but bucatini matriciana. Nina Rota's music is both traditional and playful as it captures the spirit of inflamed ovaries, overgrown indolent children, enthusiastic home cooking, mild stupefaction on the part of the young man, and Antoinetta's best efforts at seduction while having to stop to wipe a little kid's bum. Rota was Fellini's composer from The White Sheik until his death following orchestra rehearsal, author of 150 soundtracks, numerous orchestral pieces, and the award-winning music for The Godfather. The young man proves extremely open to the children he meets and to virtually every experience. Intriguingly, both movement and the apartment open out quite a bit in conjunction with the presence of children. Fellini's idealization of children's energy is also seen in La Strada, 8½, and City of Women. The old woman, too, is kind and welcoming to the newcomer. Movement slows again with Antoinetta's room and the kitchen. The actor, Marco Landi, is dressed in white, as is the youth. He comes across as more a wannabe than a star, which is perhaps why the youth never dons his white suit again. Landi's appearance somewhat demystifies movies in comparison with the little boy's experience in the provinces, though in another clear-cut distinction between Fellini's 1940s life in Rome and that of the young man, there is no hint of an emerging relationship to a movie world. We have quickly gotten the sense that the young man possesses the necessary qualities for a productive encounter with Rome and for Fellini's exploration of the city. Not only openness, but refined manners, charming modesty, and extreme good looks. His ideal nature is no doubt a principal reason that Fellini wanted to distance himself autobiographically from the figure. While there are many who accuse Fellini of unbridled egocentrism, he was not so foolish as to try to present himself in such ideal terms as a 20-something. As our 20-something politely witnesses a wacky but impressive Mussolini imitation, we get a second dominant image of a woman with black hair, fanning herself after blow-drying her hair. She is tied to the young man via cross-cutting, though not eye-line match, but she is part of the significant female experience of Rome to which he is becoming exposed. If movement slowed in the preceding scenes, it comes to a dead standstill in the room of the proprietress. She is nothing less than a monument, and her maternal monumentality is, as we have already suggested, suffocating. She lets on that she was contacted by the young man's mother, so in a sense she represents the extension of provincial mothering, but also of provincial moralism to this new environment. She confirms his refinement for us, no doubt he adds some class to her place, and Antoinetta's admiring looks repeatedly confirm how much his presence is appreciated. This imposing figure seeks to turn authoritarian all of a sudden. However, the giggling, aping children and the laughing and delightfully lascivious Antoinetta, transgressive kin to the maid in the provinces, make clear that this is Rome, not the provinces. So, in fact, is the vulgarity that sneaks back into the proprietress's own language and a rant that has tried so hard to ban it. The brief scene that follows reveals the consequences of mamismo, which, in a sense, the newcomer has already escaped by leaving the provinces. He will be a far different figure from this mama's boy who ventures out, suffers overexposure, and returns defeated to the womb. The opening street shots are wide, creating a sense of great space, especially after the scene in the boarding house owner's room. Naturally, the young man appears a bit out of place, and the glorious motion and hubbub make the provincial scenes more static than ever. Point of view loosens up significantly. Whereas he has been present for virtually every moment since he arrived in Rome, except for the preceding mother-son scene, he is not central to all the activity in the eating scenes, and he actually disappears in the final scenes that move from the center to the Appian Way. Here we have the third dark-haired woman. She spots the young man and is clearly impressed. He receives a warm invitation to sit with his boarding house mates, and the second dark-haired woman is prominent in the foreground. However, the third woman wins, and he ends up socializing with yet more new people on his first day. The blonde woman he finds seated at the table is one of the many marvelous characters that Fellini sketches briefly but fully in the film. She is exquisitely expressive, opinionated, picky, spoiled, and narcissistic. But she can also be fleetingly courteous toward the new guest, and though she is at times harsh toward her ever-active daughter, she ends up being permissive later in the scene. The dark-haired woman, on the other hand, is sexual and maternal but highly professional. She not only finds the young man attractive, she takes good care of him, but does so in part as trattoria proprietress, a role of which she never loses sight. Her complexity is beautifully conveyed in little time on screen. Her blend of qualities make her, in turn, attractive, and the camera eye, maybe or maybe not, the youth's point of view, lingers on her as she walks away. The camera eye, instead of fixating on her, quickly moves on as well. And it briefly detaches itself from the Roman newcomer and takes on a documentary aspect. However, when a woman stares insistently at the camera, we know that Fellini will not hide behind documentary objectivity and what is clearly his recreation. And the presence of the young man, even if now only roughly in the vicinity, lends further subjectivity to the scene. Ultimately, though, there is a roughly objective dimension to the subjective and a clearly subjective dimension to the objective in a film that refuses to accept simple and fixed filmmaking codes and positions. The arrival of a tram becomes an excuse to change camera location and to expand the range of exploration. And the film introduces a street singer whose number, Ciccio Formaggio, was not released until 1940. Providing more distance between Fellini's arrival in Rome and that of the young protagonist. And we get the only aerial shot of the evening, emphasizing both one person's distance and the sense of tight community below, from the point of view of a disgruntled diva in conflict with her macho boyfriend. As the film is temporarily freed from the centrality of our immigrant from the provinces, it gifts us with more intriguing vignettes, more impeccable mini-performances, and what might be the most seductive sequence of the film for non-Italians who have spent some time admiringly caught up in communal street life and trattoria life in Rome. Its rather intense sociality distinguishes it from the later eating scenes in Trastevere. When we return to the protagonist's table, we find him caught up in a less than relaxing family dynamic. Because Fellini loves all his characters, the blonde woman comes across as more amusing than horrid, much more concerned for her digestion than for her terribly distraught little boy. And the genial temperament of the young man seems to render him immune to the discordances of the scene. Our chanteuse is still at it, and the fact that we hear her full and rather lengthy song in its entirety reflects a kind of simple harmony to the sequence that few in the film possess. Her music smooths the stress points of lovers and family quarrels, complaints about the food, and so on. The diva is yet another dark-haired woman, a kind of she-wolf in the iconography of the school slideshow, though more feral than nurturing. She is sullenly aloof, but ultimately yielding, and contributes to the equation of Rome and woman, which, despite its importance to the film, will be quashed by Anna Magnani's appearance at the end. The trattoria owner returns in all three guises, as sexual, maternal, and professional. As the latter two, she brings a plate of snails because they are the specialty of the house, but as the first, she provides a sensually illustrated, elusive disquisition on the virtue of snails. In contrast to her generosity of spirit, the young man is immediately subjected to the kind of negativity on the part of the blonde that in a certain way aligns her with the censorious boarding house owner. One thing I love about these scenes at the table is the occasional clued outness of Peter Gonzalez. I get the feeling that as a non-Italian, he often does not understand a word of what people are saying during the shoot. Almost on cue, in reaction to the mother's behavior, the daughter rises up, faces away from the table and her family, and begins to entertain the crowd with a bawdy set of rhymes. On the basis of what we have seen of this family, we can hypothesize that the daughter's incessant acting out is the need to grab some attention, given the domineering narcissism of the mother. In effect, we have returned to the provinces and the child's need to break out. Although there is much that is seductive and comforting about this sequence, it remains in many ways the provinces writ large. The young man is confined, the characters are largely sedentary, much of the activity, such as lovers and family squabbles, are trivial and predictable, and much that appears enchanting upon a first evening in Rome would no doubt settle into off-putting repetition over time. The larger world, including a world at war, is nowhere to be seen, and the tram's arrival twice during this sequence subtly points to that missing world. The sequence ends on an image that recalls the massive immobility and physicality of the monstrous fish at the end of La Dolce Vita. The final words of the sequence are "keep still," an injunction that the remainder of the evening clearly rejects. After 3 quick cuts at the outset, the camera moves continually, with only 2 brief stops for the rest of the sequence. The tram is again significant. The tracks under repair seem to inspire alternative, profoundly cinematic travel, such as will recur again at the film's end. We abandon purely representational cinema for something between sci-fi and experimental film, with the protagonist no longer present. The quest seems to be for a healing image. Shepherds and their sheep restore a sense of well-being and calm and a reconnection with the rural in front of the Basilica of St. John Lateran. We also pass by what appears to be the tomb of Cecilia Metella, reconnecting with the slideshow of the provinces. And on the Appian Way, in a scene much more invented than perceived, we have the woman who has often served as the poster for the film, and whose black on red lend themselves to the color scheme of the opening credits. She is dark-haired again. She is monumental. In contrast to the mutilated statues that litter the landscape, she bespeaks powerful wholeness. And she seems to embody maternal strength more than sexual power. Most important, like the trattoria owner, she is very much her own person. She attends to herself, touches herself, surveys the surroundings with a commanding gaze, and also communicates a sense of restive vulnerability that is all her own and not for anyone else. She too turns away as the camera tries to approach ever closer, preventing any appropriation of her otherness. The prior sequence's initial experimentation with non-representational cinema may explain the next sequence in which a mature Fellini is making a movie. The somewhat visionary filmic quality we have just witnessed seems a prophecy of the birth of a filmmaker out of the Roman experience. We are also introduced to a new stage in life. While childhood triggered a desire for transgression and escape, and young adulthood for exploration and discovery, mature adulthood, especially for a filmmaker, seems to bring the need to give form to experience, to the past as well as to the present and to Rome. This at times seems in conflict with the more urgent artistic desire to invent. These attempts at either reflection or invention do not always turn out well. All roads may lead to Rome, but some, as we discover fairly quickly, are overly trafficked. Nonetheless, conclusions are often less fun than the process of arriving at them, and the sequences that seem to end in failure inevitably illuminate with great success. The music is from Toby Dammit, Fellini's consummate Roman road movie. The sequence is filled with self-critique. First, there's an implied distinction between real work, the toll booth operator, a mocking passerby, images of heavy construction equipment on the highway, and those who merely dabble at making films. But more important, Fellini is introduced as a figure trapped within an elaborate mechanism of filmmaking. There is all his own heavy equipment and his many crew members. He is all black clothing and invisibility when he steps out of his car, then briefly visible only to become a mere hand waving authoritatively to his crew to send them on their way. In the senses of someone who has become, through his immersion in big studio, big budget filmmaking, dissociated from his world. Overprotected as well, wearing his hat even when he is in his car. Images of protection, plastic, umbrellas, rain gear, abound. Fellini is presenting us with the highway system or autostrada that leads into Rome, including the Grande Raccordo Anulare, the great ring road that circles the city. And one of his little jokes, if we're following the equation of Roman women, is the fact that one has to pay a toll to experience the city, making it another Fellini prostitute along with those we see roadside. One of the important themes of the film, and one that surfaced in images of terrified dogs in the preceding sequence, is modernity, urbanization, technology, alienation from nature. We see the displaced horse amidst the cars and a man pushing a cart along the highway. The crisis of modernity is linked, I believe, to authorial anxiety about the alienation of high-tech film production. While the Rome of the 1940s seemed to be a village, contemporary Rome has been overlaid with a modernity that renders it impassable, while at the same time the insouciant 20-something, whose only armor was his white suit, has been replaced by a 50-something whose filmmaking apparatus is somewhat like the impenetrable shield of RoboCop's cyborg body. As people familiar with Roma might know, Fellini did not shoot this sequence on location. He recreated a strip of highway at the Italian film studio Cinecittà, much as he did with the Via Veneto and La Dolce Vita. And this total Fellinian overlay seems to be at the heart of the difficulty the director encounters in seeking some sort of entry into the city, imaginative or otherwise. There is too much Fellini and not enough Roma, and there is consequent creative uncertainty and anxiety. The rainstorm and the necessary protective gear seem a psychological reflection of unclear vision made all the more obscure by elaborate paraphernalia. The rain is created in the studio, hence consciously thematic rather than encountered by chance. There are hippies mixed in with prostitutes on the side of the road, gratuitous deployments of filmmaking equipment, gruesome accidents, conflicts between protesters and police, a reprise of the opening scene of 8½, a host of unrelated images, characters, and events that seem to have nothing to do with the highway and everything to do with the filmmaker, who despite or because of the highway does not know where he is going. He seems to be trying, and here I quote 8½, to put everything in, while, and I quote again, he has nothing to say. Not that some of what we see would not be possible within the Roman highway experience. It is just that so much of it seems forced, arbitrary, and mechanical. The unrelenting trajectory of the scene, ever deeper into filthy water, darkness, and chaos, rings more than a bit false. One of the biggest indications of crisis and anxiety is the seeming reliance on cliched Fellini-esque images and tropes. Whores, the horse, who had a much more appropriate cameo in La Strada, the man with the cart, a lorry covered with flapping shrouds. There are far too many to mention, details that prompt one to say without approbation, ah, how like Fellini. There will be similar moments later, for instance in the subway sequence in the ecclesiastical fashion show. But with a couple of exceptions, they will emerge from a much greater fusion of subject matter and imagination, of Fellini and the world he is seeking to represent through invention. I love the fact that at this point in his career, Fellini is willing to foreground bad work as part of his struggle as a filmmaker. He did so in the screen tests we see in films such as 8½, and Fellini, a Director's Notebook, but the screen tests help to contain and label a work as bad and separate it from the films as a whole. I love equally the fact that to a large extent this bad work goes unnoticed, and many people view the traffic jam sequence as just another example of Fellinian movie magic. He's awfully good, even when he is deliberately bad. Here we encounter the gruesome accident. We also begin to get a proliferation of uniformed figures. At this point, I think the sequence becomes even more of a psychodrama than what I have already suggested. So much Fellini that what we see is a kind of vision or dream, another sign of his disconnection from his world. The images of disaster multiply with such intensity, variety, gravity, and duration that they seem overdetermined, particularly when we consider they are constructed, not encountered. The images are some of the most powerful of the entire sequence and include the sort of non-representational expressiveness we saw in the preceding sequence, partly because they contain a kind of hallucinatory quality. However, the mayhem they detail is, I would argue, the projected chaos of the director's disordered imagination. At a certain point, the images captured by the crew temporarily lose focus, suggesting that the instruments of filmmaking and perception have been overwhelmed, leading to a momentary loss of consciousness. The police who appear throughout the section and who are seldom, if ever, a positive image in Fellini, seem to be forces of order generated by his psyche to try to keep his disintegrating vision in some kind of check. Reading this part of the sequence as a reflection of an artist in crisis becomes all the more tempting when we get explicit references to the opening scene of 8½, in which Guido's creative blockage has led to a nightmare of people isolated in their cars, unable to move or communicate, in a traffic jam. Because it has no logical relationship to what has preceded, the protest that suddenly materializes invites analysis as well from a psychological dream perspective. Fellini has always represented the bourgeois way of life as overprotected, overmanaged, authoritarian. The figures isolated in their cars are distinctly bourgeois, as is Fellini in his dress and upscale vehicle. The one protest sign we can clearly read asserts no to bourgeois power. It is as though the protesters have risen up within this nightmare to identify Fellini's overmanaged, controlling relation to his art and to demonstrate against it. This bourgeois sequence ends with cacophony and paralysis, as the adult Fellini's first attempt to reach the center of Rome is a failure. So perhaps is the attempt to symbolize Rome in a single central image such as the Colosseum and the Appian Way prostitute. On the other hand, the final seconds of the sequence reveal the intensity and desire with which Fellini is seeking to encounter and connect with his adopted home. This relatively brief sequence in the environs of the Villa Borghese still presents Fellini engaged with significant cinematic technology, but there is much greater communication, much greater range and fluidity of motion, and an attempt to see, not invent, contemporary Rome. The fluidity is evident not only in the opening camera movements, but in the lovely shots of a moving camera tracking an agile girl chasing a ball down a hill, which she never does possess. For Fellini files, there is a subtle reference here to Toby Dammit. Then the moving camera picks up and follows a tourist bus as it arrives in Piazza Siena. Close communication is evident in the constant chatter between Fellini's surrogate voice and crew members in buckets on high. The fact that it is not Fellini's voice is clear here, building separation between the film's narrator and its author. The British tourists bring a very different approach to shooting Rome than does Fellini. And Rome, in the end, actually looks back instead of being merely looked at, when a flirtatious Latin lover type jumps a fence, ogles the group, and offers to take a photograph of one. The scene threatens to come to a standstill of mutual oglings, seductive compliments, stilted poses on the part of both the woman and the man, and still pictures. But the movie camera refuses to stick with the point of view of the flirtatious photographer and pans away to capture other moving images of the city. Whereas Fellini was too encapsulated in the preceding sequence, his crew is too airborne here. As one bystander notes, "You're up so high you must be seeing another city." Things return to ground level with a series of conflicting points of view from a variety of political perspectives, offered by people watching the film. The presence of an audience for the filmmaking process offers another aspect of self-referentiality to this film that is so much about filmmaking and point of view. Fellini is accessible, unlike in the preceding sequence, and given lots of advice about making his film. A bourgeois gentleman takes the interestingly paradoxical position that true Romans have disappeared, replaced by smelly long hairs and drug addicts, but that Fellini shouldn't show any of this because what will others think of our lovely Roma? Intense student activists think he should be making a film from an objective perspective about the myriad political and social problems that afflict contemporary society. Fellini responds that he would rather do what he is best suited to do. For example, recount a vaudeville, or as Italians call it, variety show from 30 years ago. This may seem an escape from commitment, particularly since the activists in particular are speaking in the context of late 1960s revolutionary movements. However, Fellini was adamantly opposed to rhetoric, demagoguery, and especially violence, which he linked back to fascism. And he felt that politics of the left and right were both too often inclined toward them. Most important, the following recreation will end up being far from escapist. This figure uncovering his face and eyes recalls the cloth being pulled off the camera at the beginning of the movie theater scenes. In each case, the unveiling reveals another veil, the camera as arbiter of what we see in the first instance, and the heavily made-up mask of the performer in the second. Unmasking only to uncover new masks, the underlying and determining mask being that of Fellini, might be a useful way to describe the activity of Roma. At least at this stage in Fellini's work, this is not postmodern pessimism. Recognizing the constructed nature of perception, experience, and understanding is a sign of maturity, but so is a recognition that the mask reveals as well as conceals. It may be all we have, but it can be sufficient. We immediately see that, at least for the beginning of this sequence, the audience has far more importance than the performers. Fellini is representing multiple points of view, something that was missing during the traffic jam. This figure, in a full-body veil, anticipates important imagery of the ecclesiastical fashion show and suggests, as do the bikes of the opening scene, becoming motorcycles in the last, the accumulation and transformation of images that help structure Roma, though in a loose rather than schematic way. The veil is also a shroud, one of many in Roma, contributing to a meditation on death that must inevitably be part of a film so much about the past and the passage of time. The relationship of this dancer to the pattern of dark-haired women will become clearer later in the sequence. This reconstructed episode brings us back to the style of filmmaking that characterized the first two sections of Roma, with no Fellini and no filmmaking equipment present. The narrator too disappears as the film continues to shift between authorial absences and presences. There is a vibrant sense of community, more dynamic than in the street scene. The theater is a place where friends and to some extent family go, encounter others whom they playfully insult, play pranks on the unsuspecting, and even in the end show solidarity for performers whom they may initially harass and even banish from the stage. There is a strong emphasis on physicality and the body in the episode, perhaps in response to the overthought autostrada sequence and even the hyperventilating student intellectuals at the Villa Borghese. We have noted Fellini's emphasis on the head, bandaged and smacked in his representation of children. Here, when heads are subject to mischievous abuse, it isn't about the repression of children's thought and creativity, but rather the celebration of the anti-cerebral, a healthy slapstick denial of the intellect. Men munch on panini, mothers nurture babies, a spectator hurls a cat carcass at the stage, a child pees in the aisle, and a dim-witted Hulk suffers repeated physical humiliation, culminating with a huge wad of wet newspaper to the face. Even the terrible impressionist confirms the emphasis on the body. He imitates a man who has eaten too much, then, despite the objections of a vocal part of the audience, he mimics a woman taking a shower. Of course, ultimately, male adulation of women's bodies is the most insistent celebration of the physical during the evening. The Peter Gonzalez figure makes one of two brief appearances within the theater. and the company he keeps provides a sharp contrast to the anti-intellectualism of the evening. His male companion, a kind of dweeby aesthete judging from his dress, offers pretentious highbrow analysis of variety theater, which seems obnoxiously out of place, as does he. Whereas those around him are content to fill their mouths with food, he, as the woman next to him sagely notes, stuffs his mouth with Proust. This entire sequence illustrates Fellini's love for popular culture, deriving from his days as a cartoonist and caricaturist, and enhanced, as I have suggested, by the presence of Bernardino Saponi as a scriptwriter. The variety theater and variations on it have been a significant feature in many of his films, the first of which, co-directed with Alberto Lattuada, was called Variety Lights. Elements of variety theater appear in I Vitelloni, Knights of Cabiria, and 8½, and we might view Ginger and Fred as Fellini's representation of television's thorough debasement of his beloved vaudeville. The circus functions as a kind of variant, and it, of course, is central to La Strada, 8½, Juliet of the Spirits, and the Clowns, with hints scattered elsewhere throughout his corpus. Perhaps most relevant in terms of variety theater in Roma is the episodic nature of each. In many ways, Roma has a structure or lack of it that we might associate with vaudeville. In conjunction with Fellini's love of popular culture is his indebtedness to American models. The three figures who are being derided by the unrelenting hecklers at this moment seem in their dress and makeup to be a combination of Laurel, Hardy, and Chaplin. And the last, of course, was fundamental to characters such as Gelsomina in La Strada and Cabiria in Knights of Cabiria, played by Giulietta Messina. The interactivity of the sequence is reflected in the fact that not only do spectators have a significant impact on what is happening on stage, but Laurel, Hardy, and Chaplin fashion a song out of the heckling, wresting back some degree of authority from their tormentors. The Fred Astaire imitator, in a little while, will do very much the same thing. The flow of the evening will prove to be impressive and, unlike the trajectory of the traffic jam sequence, credibly paced and nuanced. Here we are still in the midst of conflict, stage versus spectator, spectator versus orchestra, spectators among themselves. Over the next few minutes, there will be two major shifts in tone, partly because of the structure of the variety show and partly for reasons external to it. The sequence demonstrates enormous craft. As in preceding sequences, there is continual diversity sketched briefly but with extreme dexterity. There are no false notes in contrast to the traffic jam. Entertainers in their routines are flawed to perfection, to coin an oxymoron, and the audience is an agglomeration of characters who are engaging even at their most obnoxious. Again, the entertainment of the sequence occurs as much in the audience as on stage, with a kind of comedy that suggests at heart many Romans are themselves masters of slapstick. One cannot, of course, ignore the underlying element of cruelty and incivility that are also in this sequence and that we've seen before in the movie theater. Cruelty and even violence between Romans will occur in the Trastevere sequence as well, and is something Fellini clearly sees as part of the Roman-Italian character. The tone begins to shift with the start of Amateur Hour and the dulcet tones of Stardust, that along with the Fred Astaire routine we are about to see, are two more references to American culture. In the background, with the curtain having parted, we can see the initials EIAR, which was the Italian Public Service radio broadcaster, for which Fellini had begun to work steadily by the early 1940s and where he met Giulietta Messina. The actor playing the Astaire figure, Alvaro Vitali, was discovered by Fellini for The Clowns, appeared in Fellini's 3 succeeding movies, and then became a fixture in silly Italian sex comedies, often involving students and teachers, that emerged as the Italian film industry turned to porn, both soft and hard, in the 1970s and early 1980s. He had never danced before this episode, which is not difficult to deduce. The tone further shifts with a moment of pathos, as we hear a distress call from the men's washroom, and as the call is rewarded with compassion by a spectator who heads over to help. This threatens to be fleeting and anomalous, Spectator sadism returns with the arrival of the dead cat as Fred Astaire labors up on the stage. However, Fred wins the moment as he grabs the carcass, hurls it back, and gets the last word. So you're throwing your dinner around? His chutzpah gets the audience on side. They applaud. He finishes his routine with verve, if not grace, and there is a brief moment of harmony between stage and gallery. With the introduction of the next act, the performances begin to improve. And though the insults between stage and audience continue, they serve as brief injections of comic relief, rather than being a dominant activity. Loredana is another dark-haired woman, but she is young and naive, whereas the women who function within the iconography of Roma's woman are more experienced, more sensual, and often embody a hint or more of the maternal. As a performer, Loredana is not perfect, but she is pretty, and her romantic song serves to soothe the savage breast. In this brief return to the young protagonist from the provinces, the gay figure with whom it communicates is never allowed in the same shot, implying a clear distancing. The association of the protagonist with pseudo-intellectuals, whom Fellini abhorred, and homophobia, when Fellini had numerous gay friends, is another way in which Fellini remains autobiographically distinct from this young figure. The juxtaposition of Loredana's soothing song with a moment of implied serious conflict in the audience adds yet further diversity to the sequence. Though we are about to move into the most harmonious moments of the evening, this brief interchange points to the fact that there is a real world beyond that will soon assert itself, completing a complex trajectory from humorous and entertaining mayhem to harmony and a strong sense of community, and then to tragedy and rupture. Here, for the first time, the audience seems finely tamed. This will continue with the performance of the three singing sisters who are based on the famous trio Lascano, who starred in the Italy of the 1930s and 1940s. The MC draws attention to a possible sexual pun on their names, deriving from the fact that in Italian they are the sisters Fisa, which invites the word fica, or cunt. These are true professionals, and their energy and competence generate a sense of order, a willed surrender of immature and rebellious behavior, that the MC, despite his notable size and presence, could never bring about. They sing a variety of popular songs of the era. The audience can initially be completely contained, as one man keeps requesting one of his favorite songs. But all is copacetic, so that though he is quite annoying, no one else in the crowd takes issue with him. The sisters are interesting to watch because in their upbeat numbers they combine a great deal of motion and activity with both unity and individuality, which is, after all, what singing in three-part harmony is all about. They harmonize vocally and they move together in very close proximity. But as their act goes on, they all do something slightly different, or two will do something different from the third. The variety built into their performance is just more evidence of Fellini's extraordinary attention to detail. But most important, what their performance offers is a model of community in conjunction with individuality, a fusion that Fellini sought to envision in films such as Nights of Cabiria and 8½, but that rarely occurs in a world in which self-interest so often conflicts with the greater good. Their mellow music melds with pathos and compassion as the figure in the bathroom, who we now discover is a wounded vet, emerges with Orestes, the man who helped him. Orestes is transfixed. Though he helps the soldier sit down, he never takes his eyes off the sisters. The Italian name Fisa means fixed or intent, and the sisters have indeed made everyone intent upon their performance. But of course, in this film, in which becoming fixed is seen as a problem, there is an immediate disruption. This announcement, revealing that the Allies landed in Sicily the night before, enables us to date this evening July 10th, 1943. As we shall see shortly, Fellini's introduction of the war is an indication that in abandoning the Villa Borghese discussion, he did not abandon the political. The dating of this episode not only creates distance between Fellini and the Gonzales figure, because the former was not single as represented here, but also because, by this time, Fellini was well known in theater circles, not the almost invisible spectator we see in the audience. He became friends with the famous comedian, soon-to-be movie star Aldo Fabrizi in 1943, and he also did some writing for the theater. He had already moved into the entertainment circles that would eventually bring him into contact with filmmaker Roberto Rossellini, who involved Fellini in the hugely important and successful Rome, Open City, and Paisan. Despite the interruption of the war bulletin, the audience and the trio are able to quickly reconnect, perhaps further fueled by the desire to escape the war and escape the bombast of fascist communiques. There is a relaxed joining in and letting go, a surrender of anxious consciousness consistent with the anti-cerebral drift at the outset. I find this sequence one of the most seductive and moving in all Fellini. The fact that it is a moment of slow down, almost stasis, in a film that seems much on the side of motion and change, and the fact that Fellini allows it to have such emotional weight reflects his refusal to be programmatic. All things considered, he is more interested in portraying human experience and its variety than merely passing judgment. The following act changes pace but not tone. The action picks up, as indicated in the opening words, si, va, yes, 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 we're going, referring in all likelihood to going off to war. We have a patriotic military number, but most of the performers are women. Then the battleship, which initially seems coded masculine, with two seemingly phallic guns, is feminized. A door opens, and as a woman appears at the center, the guns might be seen as two breasts, bazookas as they might be called in English. This kind of feminizing is consistent with the trajectory of the evening. For most of the show, we were subjected to a large dose of testosterone, with the dominance of fun-lovingly aggressive male spectators. Even the performers were principally male. This changed with Loredana and the three singing sisters. They wrought change even with the principal bad boy, who, despite one moment of conflict, becomes reverential at the sight of the principal dancer's bum, lofted on high. She is a performer who appeared earlier in The Veil and the Shroud, another dark-haired woman who adds complexity to the symbolism of this figure, and whose bum reincarnates the transgressive image of the schoolchildren's slideshow. Fellini does not allow this evening to end on a mellow note. The repressed discourse about politics and harsh realities at the Villa Borghese returns with a vengeance. The war bulletin and military routine anticipate the air raid sirens that drown out the music and bring the entertainment to a close. If we look back on this rather long sequence, we can now see how beautifully it has been structured, with various phases, shifts, and premonitions. We as spectators have been brought into the community that has evolved by the end, and we feel for the figures on screen, bravely trying to organize an evacuation or merely frightened and disoriented. As performers scatter every which way, shots of the abandoned stage and theater feel us leaving abandoned as well. The politics mount quickly. The word luce, or light, sounds like duce, and introduces a scene in which, instead of the organic sense of togetherness that developed during the show, we have a discipline imposed by the war forcing people to conform in darkness and in silence. The critique of fascism becomes explicit in the air raid shelter when the resentment expressed by an older man toward Mussolini is met with a prolonged bullying response by a fascist who directs a flashlight at the man's face as though it were a police interrogation. And despite the fact that total darkness is crucial at a time like this. His claim that the country is, quote, united in the certainty of victory, unquote, is more fascist bombast. In fact, as his conflict with the anti-fascists suggests, Italy is in an embryonic state of civil war, which, as Fellini knew well, reached full force less than 2 months later, when with Mussolini deposed, the king and the head of the military fled to the south, leaving the country in shambles, with fascists fighting partisans and people forced to choose sides with either the Germans or the Allies. We continue to get shifts in tone as the harshness of the confrontation gives way to an encounter between our young protagonist and one of the dancing sailors. In contrast to the intolerance of the fascist, who had actually used the word intolerable with regard to the older man, she invokes tolerance in at least two ways. She's married with children, and her husband is on the Russian front. But wartime separation plus her own candor mitigate any judgment that her brief involvement with a handsome young Italian might evoke. Perhaps more important, she fully humanizes the scene with her extraordinary gentleness, which plays against Italian ethnic stereotypes that can be as rigid as attitudes about marital fidelity. She also breaks stereotype in a different way. As an attractive and nurturing blonde woman, in a film that seemed to be setting up a pattern around encounters with numinous dark-haired figures, she seems to weaken the symbolic exclusivity of the latter. All seems clear, and the young provincial receives an invitation to go home with his new acquaintance. However, this coupling never occurs, at least as far as we can tell, one of many actions and intentions that remain incomplete or unfulfilled in the film. The bombardment shatters all sense of security, the assurance, for example, that the Pope is some kind of shield. The scene is effectively unrealistic. It is compressed. We hear the bombs, and immediately a woman runs and reports on what happened. The timing is impossible, but the compression heightens the sense of urgency. We hear her voice, but her image is only two small figures in the distance. An image all in shadow, and a shadow of the shadow on a tunnel wall. The splitting of voice and image and of her image itself is wrenching, as is the anguish she expresses in contrast with the tininess of her presence. The sound of the sirens is oppressive, violent, and contributes to the sense of desperation, as two figures, or actually four with splitting, run toward each other. It seems all four will collide. The sirens are joined by the sound of an airplane, and the violence culminates in the shocking image of the shadow of the ambulance long after we might expect it, rushing along the wall of the tunnel and obliterating as it passes the split image of the woman. The scene, brief as it is horrible and captures the absolute unpredictability of life in wartime. It also speaks to Italy in the 1970s, as one shocking event that has already occurred, the right-wing bombing in Piazza Fontana, Milan, December 1969, inaugurates a decade of terrorist acts. From violence in the past, we move to a kind of violence in the present, the building of the subway, which requires sensitive excavation that respects Rome's enormous archaeological heritage. In a sense, this is an object lesson of how one makes a movie about Rome, excavating in one's past, honoring what needs to be preserved, and taking care that the heavy equipment of excavation/filmmaking does not get in the way of or destroy what it is seeking to access. It is an object lesson for experience in general. The engineer who serves as guide during this sequence notes that, quote, "the Roman subsoil is very unpredictable," unquote. That could easily be adapted as Fellini's motto for life, hence for the need to be profoundly open and flexible, which was in fact something he greatly admired about his mentor Rossellini. There are numerous differences between this and the prior major 1970s sequence, the traffic jam. For one thing, Fellini does not seem in control. He disappears from the film and gives free rein to his crew. For another, it is not directed toward a single goal, such as accessing the Roman center. Third, and linked to the first two, it is about exploration, not just representation. Fourth, he invests an expert, an engineer, with the role of mediating between the crew and the subject matter that is being filmed. Fifth, the sequence has much more the feel of location shooting, rooted in the fact that though the construction site was recreated at Cinecittà, he and Zapponi did location scouting, taking a thorough and rather terrifying tour of an actual site. It should be clear by now, a significant part of Roma has to do with Fellini modeling different modes of filmmaking, different ways of relating as director to his material. In this scene, there's a kind of authorial game going on. Fellini is absent, though we know he's the director. We see lots of filmmaking equipment on the screen, but it is rarely, if ever, the source of the metafilm. The episode is set up as documentary, but quickly injects blatantly Fellini-esque scenes. The corridors of stacked documents satirizing Roman bureaucracy, a couple in their apartment shaken as by an earthquake by the tremors of the subway. As well, the shadows on the tunnel wall interject an aesthetic or subjective dimension to the filmmaking. There might seem to be something specious about a filmmaker playing with his presence or absence when he is always, ultimately, the source of the film we're seeing. However, Fellini recognizes that as author he's involved in a complex set of relationships to his text. And in films such as The Clowns, Fellini, A Director's Notebook, and Roma, he chooses to make this part of the subject matter. He does not believe in a simplistic oneness of authorship, so he models a diversity of authorships that comprise and in a certain sense qualify that oneness. Put another way, Fellini, the changeable and often conflicted director, becomes a character. The precursor to this was, of course, Guido in 8½. As several commentators on the film have pointed out, there's a strong phallic dimension to the sequence. The forced entry into the old Roman villa will be especially phallic. Here, however, there's also the humanizing presence of the unnamed female assistant who speaks German, aligning her with the blonde dancer of the preceding sequence. She is likewise quite sensitive, noting the difficult conditions of the laborers. While the engineer is our source of factual information, she is a kind of emotional guide. Among other things, this is clearly a journey into the unknown, into the underworld, with Virgilian and Dantean nuances, a land of departed spirits, cessati spiriti, as the engineer references at one point, and the evidence of which we see in the necropolis, whose discovery brought one of the innumerable archaeological stoppages to the subway excavations. Like the preceding sequence which culminated in destruction and death, it offers a powerful memento mori. Among the many fine mini-performances in Roma, and this one is not so many, is that of the Anglo-Indian actor Marnie Maitland as the engineer. He displays a compelling combination of professionalism, patience, exhaustion, resignation, stick-to-itiveness, and unflappability, as well as a subtle tension between emotional distance from and involvement in his work. This sequence illustrates yet again Fellini's discomfort with modernity. The noise of the descent and of work at the bottom is incessant and interferes with communication. Technology puts people where they don't belong, far underground and in the dark. The difficult conditions make the sequence a kind of ode to Roman labor, rebutting the comment about the laziness of the Romans at the Villa Borghese. Returning to an earlier analogy between this sequence and filmmaking, I am tempted to read it as Fellini's oblique celebration of the massive, varied, and committed activity on the part of countless technicians and laborers that goes into the making of a film. Up till now, aside from his two digressions, Fellini's recreation of the environment and work on the subway have been realistic and convincing. However, we can spot a couple of cheap sci-fi images, such as the bizarre face-like contraption that seems something out of Fellini's Satyricon, apart from its lights. Perhaps even more striking is the gauge workers are intently studying to get a sense of a new hollow space that has been discovered beyond the walls. It is beyond me how this device could tell anyone anything. The extraordinary competence of Fellini and his collaborators make clear that this is not some slip in craftsmanship. Instead, it anticipates the limits to technology as a means of access to the human spirit that will become clear shortly. The sudden illness here of the crew member Amerigo presages a disastrous collision between present and past provoked by technological intrusion. Succeeding shots present the machinery as a massive obstacle that must be shut down and avoided in order for people to negotiate the space. The range of citations, Virgil, Dante, clearly Metropolis, and I'm sure the viewer can name others, and the range of styles, including big-budget and cheapo sci-fi, point to the eclecticism of Fellini, as well as to his continuing fidelity to popular culture on some level, despite his adoption at this point in his career by a certain international highbrow intelligentsia. There is a significant rupture in logic that helps prepare for the profoundly undocumentary scenes that are to follow. The introduction of bad sci-fi can be seen as another. The new discovery means, as it is made emphatically clear, that work must stop for the moment. The engineer confirms this after examining the wall of the tunnel. He even hypothesizes that there could be catacombs. However, in what seems dramatically out of character for such a cautious, rational figure, he proposes testing the wall in different places and orders the startup of the mole. Knowing he should stop, he goes ahead, and it is this implausible indiscretion that makes possible one of the most extraordinary moments in all Fellini. This is one of several instances in Fellini's work in which rational activity arrives at a dead end, but some abrogation of the rational leads to a radically new reality, which in this case will be both marvelous and heart-wrenching. The sound is piercing, the machine seems reptilian, prehistoric, perhaps calling into question the notion of technological progress, which that silly gauge certainly does, but also linking two very different concepts of prehistory, the pre-human and the classical Roman. The camera shift behind the wall to the Roman villa confirms that we are leaving documentary realistic storytelling behind. It is as though the void announced by the workers has provided Fellini a tabula rasa on which to paint a vision of his own after the lengthy constriction of the tunnel in a simulated documentary form. However, the more insistent the mole, and the closer we get to breaching the barrier to the past, the sicker Amerigo becomes. As we return inside the Roman villa, we see the reason for his distress. He is the first figure in the first set of murals. A part of him is under imminent threat. By placing Amerigo both inside and outside his imminent victim, Fellini uses his poetic license to increase the pathos of what is about to happen. Loss becomes embodied, not just figures on a wall. At the same time, the young woman becomes our principal guide for the remainder of the sequence, replacing the engineer who has renounced his role as rational helmsman and providing continual emotional input to what we experience. The phallic mole has been replaced by the uterine opening in the wall, which births people into the villa. The roaring wind seems to make some claim for the revenge of nature over technology, though nature or the air of the present, allowed into the villa by the mole and human curiosity, will prove the undoing of the past. The wind in this sequence is one of the most striking representations in the film of the unstoppable forces of change that Rome, as past, present, experience, and myth, bespeaks. The technology we see in this sequence is minimal, principally headlamps and flashlights that furnish uncertain and disorienting illumination. The crew and workers appear as aliens or astronauts, masked and helmeted, exploring a newfound planet. Future enters in with present and past. As at other moments in the film, the camera comes alive and this initially still world is whirled into continual motion, thanks to vibrantly mobile cinematography. This might be the place, although there are so many in the film, to acknowledge the wonderful work of Giuseppe Rotunno, amply awarded director of photography, who worked on several of Fellini's most important color movies, as well as with Luchino Visconti, Vittorio De Sica, Robert Altman, and Bob Fosse. Despite the wind, there is an atmosphere of calm within the villa. In fact, the wind itself becomes almost a tranquil voice, accompanying the contemplative exploration of seemingly boundless art. In its artistic richness, the villa might be seen as a mirror of this film, with its celebration of music, theater, photography, cinema, dance, vaudeville, architecture, painting, sculpture, fashion, and who knows what else. The young woman assistant is again the voice of sensitivity, of the ability to acknowledge what is around her. Michele, look at their faces. They seem to be staring at us. Her latter comment confirms Fellini's fondness for having his characters look back at the camera. There are two interracial couples depicted, which seems to anticipate the brief following scene of hippies on the Spanish Steps, and that serves as another way in which Fellini inserts the present into the past. Here we have the most pronounced image of a woman turned away, linked to the inaccessibility of Rome. Her inaccessibility signals the disappearance of the frescoes in what to me is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the history of cinema, partly because of its relative lack of mediation. We experience not a representation of loss so much as loss itself, as the images disappear before our eyes. The woman responds with desperation, seeking to touch and hold the images, that comes across as excessive, somewhat melodramatic. Her grief expresses one aspect of the scene, but I think there's another. In the villa, for the first time, images of the past are not associated with memory. They are not of the self, they are other, confirmed by their ability to disappear. Otherness, when truly acknowledged, is liberating, as Fellini himself has noted. It frees one from the desire to possess. The greatest appreciation of otherness can occur paradoxically when the other disappears and no longer exists with reference to oneself. For me, the loss of the images is indeed shocking, but the experience of otherness endures in other than tragic ways. This brief scene of hippies on and around the Spanish Steps communicates a number of things. Rome as an indulgent home or mother for people from everywhere, racial and sexual openness and freedom, but on the downside, extreme and probably drug-induced lethargy. People are seated or lying down, and when they look in the camera, it seems to be mainly because they have nothing better to do. Fellini using self-referentiality in yet another way. Whereas the intensity of the Roman student intellectuals at the Villa Borghese sent him back to the past, it appears that the inactivity and immobility of this group does the same. As the free love of the hippies triggers memories of the far more restrictive days of brothels, Fellini shifts narrative mode again. The narrator returns, but instead of providing a brief introduction or description for the audience, he asks us a question: do you remember? This capacity for intimate address is yet one more filmic option that Fellini briefly explores. The opening shots are filled with images and sound that provide a rich glimpse of Roman life as seen on and from the street. Cats, toilet seats, piano practice, bells, a luxury furniture store, butchered meat, artisans, children rich and poor. The appearance of soldiers reminds us of the war, while two sudden shifts in tone capture attention between rebelliousness and conformity. Roughhousing like kids, the soldiers snap to attention at the sight of an officer, then the solemnity of bells and portentous zoom in on the house number of the brothel give way to an explosion of energy as the boys burst through the front door. While their behavior recalls the playful masculinity of the Barafonda audience, the world of the brothel is a matriarchy, following upon the emergence of a strong feminine sensibility at the Barafonda and the centrality of Fellini's female assistant to the latter part of the subway sequence. The inner doors to the brothel seem under the magical control of the doorwoman's will, opening with no apparent action on the part of the boys. We encounter a kind of traffic jam again, but in the course of the three brothel sequences, the jam will dissolve, and access will be gained to the kind of meaningful Roman experience that was missing from the autostrada. There is, however, a strong class dimension as the brothels evolve from lower to upper class, and meaningful experience seems only possible in the latter. Tellingly, there is no sign of the provincial protagonist in the lower class scenes. This first sequence is the diametric opposite of the hippie scenes, constricted versus wide open spaces, but non-stop energy as opposed to general stasis. The men act like kids, but so do some of the prostitutes, sticking out their tongues, as did the young girl in the trattoria scenes, though clearly with different intent. The second sequence is a step up class-wise. It is far less claustrophobic, though a thunderstorm and the low ceiling contribute to some continuing sense of entrapment. The space is laid out horizontally rather than confined to a corridor, allowing the women to parade and the men freer space to observe. We, like the men, get a much better sense of the distinctiveness and individuality of the women. There seems greater possibility of choice, and supply seems somewhat more equal to demand. The movement of the women dictates the movement and often the perspective of the camera. There is a strong element of spectacle, of men watching the women, but the relationship between audience and performer is much more interactive than it was even at the Barafonda. Just as Fellini presents multiple modes of narrative and cinematic practice, he offers a large variety of audiences and audience spectacle relationships throughout the film. Though there is still an assembly line quality to the proceedings, and there are some ugly exchanges between clientele and both the sex workers and the management, there is space, literally and figuratively, for more humanized activity. A woman orders a cappuccino for a co-worker. There are brief moments of friendly interaction between women and their customers. Unlike in the first sequence, there is a good deal of emphasis on an upstairs space accessible via two staircases. And though this sequence does not give us access, the third brothel sequence will take us to the top. Given Fellini's aversion to high-tech modernity in much of the film, I take great pleasure in the clunky but efficient operation of the brothel's switchboard, whose incessant buzzing elevates it almost to the status of the bells that toll throughout the movie. As closing time approaches, we see the desperate need of the women to make a living. Many of them become fiercely active and extreme in their behavior, seeking to differentiate their brand from that of others, as they hope to get one more client before things shut down. Their working conditions lead to conflict, which further reveals their humanity as the sequence progresses. They must work non-stop in a chaotic atmosphere, alternating between sex and performance. They have no control over their earnings and little control over their belongings because they are constantly occupied. As is revealed during the sequence, they are vulnerable to theft and to a climate of distrust and of everyone for herself that their work situation promotes. Fellini's implicit critique of prostitution focuses not on sexual mores, but on conditions of work, in one of the film's many references to labor. Closing time confirms the matriarchal operation of the brothel and points to the fact that houses of prostitution were one of the only places where women of the time had true authority. The pesticide sprayer used to clear people out is comic and a far gentler strategy than what the police will employ with the young folk in the Piazza of Santa Maria in Trastevere. The sequence concludes with compassion. We see the effects of hard work on one woman's body. The song another woman sings, "Who Knows Why We Live," captures the emotional toll this kind of life takes. The sound of rain on the skylight and bells tolling provide a sense of comfort, but the comfort that comes from a temporary break in an arduous and unforgiving life, not from true enjoyment and recreation. In recreating yet another brothel, this time upper class, Fellini reveals again his ability to render multiple environments. Our young protagonist appears here and is, as always, impeccably dressed. His manners impel him to remove his hat and smooth his hair. His companion is in some ways his opposite, and they comprise a kind of clown couple similar to what Fellini presented in The Clowns. The youth is the white clown, all prim and proper, slim, tall, clean-shaven, composed, though somewhat nervously. His companion is the much less contained Auguste, short, somewhat overweight, heavily bearded, and constantly emitting a nervous laugh. It is as though the protagonist needed his opposite, someone capable of acting out what he himself suppresses, to usher him into this kind of world and experience. Initially, the brothel is quiet, with few people spaced widely apart, in sharp contrast to the first two. Apparently, the protagonist and his friend have gotten early admission, for quickly crowds arrive, though never filling the ample space, as earlier crowds did their far more constricted spaces. This world has a kind of happy medium in terms of Fellinian technology, an elevator that works much better than the vehicles on the autostrada or the little train in the subway sequence in carrying people to their desired destination. The elevator is associated with a tram-like bell, and is like a tram in its modest and effective functionality. There is a continuous incitement to motion, andiamo, which was present in the earlier scenes, but here there truly seems somewhere to go. Whereas the earlier brothels offered an increasing diversity of women from the Italian peninsula, this one offers a more international selection. The open flowing rooms plus the flow of the prostitutes within them allow for far more adventurous camera movements, and the wall-to-wall mirrors extend the visual field, at times doubling it. The field of the film is extended farther when one woman offers her enticements directly to us. The prostitutes demonstrate slicker routines, more confidence and cool in their demeanor than what we saw in the lower-class houses. The balletic motion of the spectacle comes to a sudden halt when the elevator delivers Dolores, dressed as a Messalina figure. She is clearly the diva of the place. She stands as a monument, impassive and seemingly inaccessible, except on a purely professional, pay-as-you-go basis. Our young hero edges forward in rapt attention, responding to her imposing presence with a smile, one might say of recognition. Recognition, perhaps, of the young boy's provincial cinema fantasy of Messalina. He too smiled, as we recall, but certainly of the numinous dark-haired woman who has been forming in his and the film's consciousness. Her brief appearance becomes melded with mystery as there is a temporary stoppage of activity and closing of doors to allow some powerful figure to ascend without being seen. Up there is not only the dark-haired archetypal diva, but a place of high-powered male legitimacy. Matriarchy is strongly confirmed within the workings of the brothel, though patriarchal power beyond is acknowledged by the careful attention given to ushering this luminary to his desired destination without compromising his anonymity. and by providing him with the choice of all the remaining women who were sent upstairs to be at his disposal. If Dolores's monumental appearance slowed things nearly to a standstill, turning the crowd of bewitched male onlookers to pillars of hopeless desire, the workings of invisible but all-determining male power stopped things altogether. So absolute is the stasis, there is nothing to be seen on screen, and the two women managers look at us and smile as though to say, "There's nothing going on here. What are you up to?" Our protagonist returns alone, presumably in the morning, to have Dolores all to himself. He seems free, unemployed, in contrast to Fellini at that point in his life. The comment, "experience, that's what counts in life," implies the significance of this experience for the young man. The comment, "if your son's experienced, he'll never have any problems," raises the gendered question, what does Dolores's ample experience do for her? It marginalizes her morally, culturally, and in terms of class. Yet prostitution is one of the few things she can do to earn a living and raise a son as a woman in the Italy of the time. I think class difference underlies the entire encounter. We initially think our young man is in awe of a monumental figure, but he demonstrates comfort, not awe, after they've had sex. This leads him to compliment her beauty and ask a number of personal questions. But he has difficulty finishing a question about how long she has been a prostitute. There is an undercurrent of class entitlement in his comfort in conversation. She may have the edge archetypally, but he has the edge in terms of cultural capital. His inability to finish the question suggests some embarrassment about the subject, which implies a kind of bourgeois judgment. There is also a hint that he feels he can save her from her plight. She does not take offense and gradually relaxes her self-protective distance, opening up in a way that gives her a backstory that no one else in the film enjoys. She may lose her numinosity, which is crucial to the desymbolizing of women in Rome in the film, but she gains her humanity and becomes the most significant part of the humanizing of sex workers that occurs in these sequences. The young man, too, opens out, becomes more humanized in this, his final appearance in the film. Dolores agrees to a date which seems to offer one goal finally achieved in a Rome of so many dead ends. And though facing out the window, she turns back toward the youth, breaking the dominant pattern of women turned away. However, there is something improbable, even impossible, about the courtship, and we never see it realized. Despite this encounter's emotional resonance for both characters, it ends up in narrative terms going nowhere. On the other hand, in both language and the opening of the window, the final moments of the sequence emphasize getting out and moving beyond the enclosure that has characterized much of these three sequences. Perhaps the most famous sequence in Roma is the ecclesiastical fashion show. Having shown us something of classical, fascist, and contemporary Rome, Fellini now presents Baroque Rome, Rome of the Counter-Reformation, and what has been called the black aristocracy, the Roman aristocracy with strong ties to the papacy. Princess Domitilla is a matriarch of sorts, but in servitude to the patriarchal church, as we can see from the portraits being remounted on the wall. The vast empty spaces, the still likenesses of what in a sense seem ghosts, and the slowness with which they are moved into place convey the death and life of this old order. The portraits seem slightly unreal, verging on caricature, and the way they jiggle on the wires makes them seem like marionettes, suggesting the hidden and intricate workings of ecclesiastical power. They are no doubt the work of painter Rinaldo Geleng or his sons Giuliano and Antonello, who worked on the film. Rinaldo is generally credited with the frescoes in the underground villa. Whereas we have witnessed the predominance of male figures give way to females in prior sequences, we begin here with the princess, who appears ghostly herself, as hostess of a huge celebration, but end with the frightening and domineering visage of the Pope. The sequence seems summoned from her imagination. She claims to have heard the sound of a carriage, which seems impossible given the cloistered world of the palazzo, and who in these days would be arriving by carriage. Entering like an apparition are a cardinal and numerous other guests, too numerous for a carriage. The lighting and movement as the princess and cardinal greet each other have the character of a horror film rather than of an actual reunion. The suggestion that this scene originates in Princess Domitilla's imagination helps displace some of the absurdity of this sequence from Fellini onto a character. Fellini seems comfortable representing a Rome of the present that is really a Rome of the past. In the protected environs of the black aristocracy, he finds a world he can recreate with relative ease, and with technology he can mock in the protected enclosure of his beloved Theater 5 at Cinecittà. On the other hand, the excesses of a cloistered imagination, which are precisely what the princess represents, might be seen as a self-imposed warning by Fellini on the dangers of his own tendency to remain cloistered. The cardinal is another wonderfully conceived figure, offering a combination of saintliness and obesity, gentility and simple-mindedness, as well as an inordinate fear of children, whom he identifies as troublemakers and devils and whom he hurries off to bed. Fellini does not present him in as any way evil, but more as an overprotected innocent who does the church's work without really knowing what lies behind that work. The fact that he has poor vision and wears dark glasses conveys his insulating blindness. He recalls the naive monks who populated Roberto Rossellini's The Flowers of St. Francis, a film scripted by Fellini. Except for the fact that unlike St. Francis, who gave away all his worldly goods, the cardinal lives in an atmosphere of extreme luxury. In fact, spirituality seems to be in rather short supply here. When the princess recalls the cardinal coming to do the Stations of the Cross, she says, "What a show," focusing on the glamour of the event instead of on religious discipline and practice. If we see the fashion show as emanating from her imagination, it makes clear that her attraction to the church is largely because of its spectacle. Something else that seems to attract her is extreme orderliness, for there are many moments when the guests sit or stand still for unreal amounts of time that can only be attributed to a vision or waking dream. In fact, the extreme courtesy, the reliance on rules of etiquette, the formality are so pronounced that they seem less the normal conduct of social life than the product of an obsessive need for control, which Counter-Reformation Catholicism can both represent and offer. There is a subtly humorous emphasis on alcohol here. The cardinal is delighted the aperitivo has arrived, and the clergy prove more than willing recipients of their drinks. This is Fellini's gentle way of suggesting the earthly appetites of the church, in the absence of the kind of spirituality we might associate with St. Francis. In the course of this sequence, numerous figures look directly at the camera and at us, implying for the most part our intrusiveness, particularly to the extent that they might be facets of the princess's dreaming imagination. This would certainly be the case. For one woman who later distances herself from the Pope's apparition, we may be a source of curiosity, a place she would rather be. As so often, a cinematic gesture on Fellini's part can have multiple meanings. As we listen to the princess, we are again struck by the emphasis on spectacle, on glorious balls with cardinals dressed in red. There is also a longing for permanence, for the feeling of living in a painting, and the importance of material objects, statuettes, crosses, velvet. But perhaps the most important thing is what she mentions first, the relationship to power that must have been so important to a woman without prospects, or only those like Dolores's, on her own. The loss of friendship with the church is a loss of proximity to, quote, Monsignor's cardinals, the Pope, unquote. Nowhere in her soliloquy is there a mention of spirituality. However, the depth of her grief and the psychology behind it make her very sympathetic. Whereas Fellini's young assistant mourned the loss of the other in the Roman villa, Princess Domitilla mourns the loss of herself. We can see the ecclesiastical fashion show as her attempt at recuperation. Here we need to credit set designer Danilo Donati. His work on this film is obviously superlative. He won Academy Awards for Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet and Fellini's Casanova, as well as numerous awards in Italy for his work with Visconti and Pier Paolo Pasolini. Costume designer Piero Tosi was especially important to this sequence, but crucial as well to the many, many looks of the film. He worked on several of Visconti's most important films and with directors such as De Sica and Liliana Cavani. Nino Rota's work is exquisite throughout this sequence, often interweaving music from La Dolce Vita. The first figure recalls earlier shrouded images. Images of death will enter the fashion show as they have entered the film. In any case, the figure seems to be some representation of the soul or of spiritness, which, in the princess's mind, should be guiding the show. Apropos of this image, one might claim that by attributing this vision to the princess, and I'm still postulating that as a possibility, Fellini lets himself off the hook for hokey imagery, lapses of taste, and so on. But since he is also dreaming up the princess, the buck stops with him. Moreover, the gratuitous movements of the first pair of nuns parody fashion show choreography, something the princess would not be doing. The winged outfits, designed for spaces with poor ventilation, and the galloping exit of the nuns who sport them are pure Fellini. And we are just at the beginning. In the end, the fashion show is a lovely mixture of Fellini inventiveness, critique of a modernizing church in the absence of spirituality, and a princess's profound pathos at a world that is changing and leaving her behind. It is also a mixture of religion, high culture, and a form of spectacle, the fashion show, that while originating in high culture, has consistently gravitated toward celebrity and entertainment culture. It is this gravitation that enables Fellini to ensnare it in his low-culture tentacles of cartoon and caricature. One of the strategies that tends to add to the cartoonish is having the models appear in couples on the runway. Doubling the gratuitous moves doubles the fun. Ever faster to paradise, the priests on skates reflect the fact that the modern world requires more speed, more efficiency. But it is also part of the fashion show's substitution of the physical for the spiritual. The movement of the spirit becomes the movement of skates and priests running when they are not skating. Though the skates draw audience approval, they are superseded by bicycles, which again suggest both modernization and motion as a false substitute for spirit. One thing that deserves comment here, and really throughout the film, is Fellini's choice of faces. He often traveled through Italy in search of them, and he felt they were the inspiration for much of his filmmaking. And of course, once he became famous, people from all over the world sent their photographs in the hopes of being in a Fellini film. I've commented on the countless perfect little performances that populate the film. They all start and often end with the perfect face for the occasion. We now move to sacristans, the increasing accoutrements of church ritual, and an accompanying upswing in prayer wear. The new accoutrements require a multiplication of gratuitous moves, of which this model is clearly a master. The emulation of spirit becomes the simulation of flight, and this figure has developed an extraordinary technique of floating that seems to catapult him to the verge of defeating gravity. From variations on speed and even flight, we now move to the unbearable lightness of new fabrics, again the spirit rendered in material terms. With this evolution, as the MC calls it, our little spirit figure seems to have had enough. It is as though the modernization undergone by the church has rendered spirit obsolete, so he or she just slips away. But the vestments don't appear lighter, they appear more ornate, more cumbersome. And as we begin to lose sight of a human dimension altogether, we hear the music of La Dolce Vita interspersed with the music that has dominated this sequence. We see vestments without people, mere shells with bobblehead tops, that required that the runway become a conveyor belt. And vestments appear with flashing neon lights, in which the spirit is not now pawned off as speed, flight, or airiness, but as illumination. The vacuity of this display even puts the cardinal to sleep. Suddenly, the little spirit figure who slipped away seems to have come back, transformed into a ghastly, shrouded image of suffering. Surrounded by falling petals, she appears to be a grotesque and anguished version of Bernini's The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. St. Teresa was a major saint of the Counter-Reformation, and Bernini's sculpture a fundamental achievement of the Italian Baroque. Both his sculpture and this figure capture the contorted emotion, melodrama, and theatricality of that artistic moment, and of a counter-Reformation Catholicism that seems in the death throes of its own suicide in the face of modernization. However, true to Fellini's refusal to be simply critical, this figure also captures the pathos that underlies the theatricality, the pain, and the melodrama. We then return to a fairly normal parade of bishops. They are all white, and despite differences in size, bespeak a suffocating sameness, reflected in the monotony of their movements. They seem ciphers whose vestments and paraphernalia are more important than they are. They are perhaps the most concrete critique of the church in this sequence because they capture the impassivity and impenetrability of the institution. Their parade around the runway seems unnecessarily long, in part because they lack the flash and the glitter to keep us entertained. But the point seems to be that after the flash and the glitter, we are back to the same old church. Not only that, but the church and the fashion show are running out of steam. The stockinged figure who seems the only outlier in the group anticipates the caravan of skeletons and skulls that comes skittering along the conveyor belt. Whereas the anguished figure from moments before implied soul or spirit in dire straits, these figures are merely death without resurrection. They represent the reduction of life to mere physical existence and the disappearance of a sense of anything more, and the absence of a source of religious vision and sustenance. This conclusion is so clear, so comprehensible, that all rise as though they intuitively recognize that the show is over. However, despite the seeming triumph of death and nothing more, there will be, much as happens at the end of The Clowns, though in a very different spirit, a resurrection. Is this Princess Domitilla's vision? Is it Fellini's closing commentary on the show? Is it born of the collective imagination of the black aristocracy and the clergy? It may well be all three, but in addition it has the character of a miracle, an apparition, an unexplained eruption, much as the motorcycles at the end of the film will be. The mechanics of the set recall the tackiness of the gauge in the subway sequence. There is something contrived about this, somewhat in keeping with the histrionics of the reincarnated Saint Teresa and of the princess. The figure who is resurrected is not the engaging Pope John XXIII, whom Fellini greatly admired, nor even the reigning pope at the time, Paul VI. Pius XII came from the black aristocracy. He was an austere and conservative pope. There were questions regarding his papacy during the Second World War and the Holocaust. In the context of the film, we might describe him as the pope who carried Counter-Reformation Catholicism farthest into the 20th century. That this is a collective vision is suggested by the fact that so many people implore the Pope to come back, an acknowledgement that he is not truly there. His image remains cold and distant. The music is jarring, emphasizing rupture and loss, not restoration. Another center that proves unattainable. Fellini out-baroques the Baroque in representing this figure of almost blinding light as frightening rather than reassuring. There is no resurrection of Christ, no resurrection of the Spirit, merely the illusory return of institutional authority and power that have replaced the spiritual mission of the Church. There are at least two lessons here for Fellini in the context of his film. One, there are dangers living too much in the past. Two, there are equal dangers in retreating into a world of Baroque or Fellini-esque overwrought fantasy. Both can be forms of arrested development. In any case, he shifts to location filmmaking in the streets of Trastevere. We hear a voice cueing a small band. Is it the narrator appropriating on-site music in contrast to the dominant imposed music of the fashion show? We can't be sure, but it points to another variation on the relationship between author and world, author and text. The camera has greater horizontal mobility than at any other point in the film. The horizontality suggests broad connectedness to the world and is in direct contrast to the vertical thrust of the papal apparition. We are reminded of the trattoria sequences of the young man's first evening in Rome, but we are not attached to a single figure or a single activity, eating. And the camera more freely changes direction and points of interest. There is not one community, but several. The dominance of audio, street sounds, slivers of conversation, singing, etc., emphasizes the immersion of the filmmaking apparatus and crew in the environment and the moment. As a group of people, including the film crew, emerges from a narrow street, we are surprised to find Fellini buried amongst them and initially indistinguishable. His presence is very brief and unnoteworthy. He is not functioning as a director, and he will not appear on camera for the remainder of the film. His non-authorial cameo seems to be consistent with his desire, especially after the subway sequence, to minimize his role as director and allow himself to become diffused throughout his film, via figures such as the Princess Domitila, or in this sequence and as in earlier ones, through his crew. He seeks ways of opening himself out in contrast to the black aristocracy and becoming integrated within the text rather than controlling it from without. Ultimately, his ideal is to have the work take on a life of its own and direct him rather than vice versa. Although on some level Fellini always remains a director, he models the unrealizable ideal of losing himself in his creations and having them show him the way. Filming this sequence as simulated documentary or simulated cinema verite is part of that modeling. The images in the mirrors at the antique stall capture the diversity of this festa. The clearly local vendor can talk of visits to the cemetery, while an elegant international displays narcissistic detachment. The rootlessness of the contemporary world is captured by the dialogue, now he wants to go to Istanbul, by the frequent change in camera direction, and by the sudden appearance of two Great Danes who wander into the frame. We are back to a Fellini who in a few brief seconds can create mini-portraits and mini-environments of convincing authenticity. The documentary style, the extraordinary freedom of the camera, kudos to Giuseppe Rotunno again, the choreography, the accompaniment of atmospheric music, the flow of people, and the seamless editing provide a cinematic sense of connection that compensates for the attenuation of human connection. The church still has not fully integrated with the world of the 1970s, though it is still in the vicinity. Alcohol, or should we say spirits, again seem for Fellini a defining element of religious community. Up until now, all the elements of the sequence, but perhaps the music above all, have created a sense of harmony, giving the viewer the feeling of at-homeness yet anonymity that I have found whenever I have spent much time in Rome or Trastevere. The street fight, although just a brief moment, signals what will turn out to be an increasing emphasis on aggression and conflict in the sequence. The appearance of Gore Vidal was to be one of 4 cameos in the final scenes. One other by Anna Magnani remains. 2 by the Italian actors Alberto Sordi and Marcello Mastroianni were dropped, reportedly because United Artists wanted to shorten the international version of the film. The interviews present on this Criterion release are clumsy, and both actors address Fellini off camera, contradicting the notably low-key presence of the director earlier in the sequence. There is no indication of his presence for the Vidal interview. I have a feeling the interviews were dropped for aesthetic, as well as practical reasons. Vidal's presence seems to offer Fellini the opportunity for a summary statement about Rome, but the film ends up rejecting such things. In that light, his comments about Romans' overpopulation and observing the end of the world come across as bombastic, the kind of intellectual generalization that Fellini found uncongenial. No doubt Vidal was in on the parody because he and Fellini worked at some length on the dubbing of Vidal's disquisition. His words about observing the end are further undercut when they are immediately followed by the scene in which bourgeois restaurant patrons observe from a distance as police brutally attack a group of peaceful counterculture youth hanging out in the piazza of Santa Maria in Trastevere and singing about being, quote, one human family, unquote. This scene is in a way a response to the student intellectuals of the Villa Borghese. Fellini opposes violence and oppression, as I suggested earlier, always using fascism as his model. Unlike student radicals, many of whom advocated violence in the 1960s, these young folk are opting for a new way of being, which Fellini embraced around the time of Fellini's Satyricon, but in which he had somewhat lost hope by now. The authority who comforts the bourgeoisie and dismisses the community of youngsters as delinquents, vagabonds, and druggies represents the neo-fascism that has been a consistent part of Italian post-war politics and that contributed to the right-wing violence of the 1960s and 1970s. The apparent refusal of any onlookers to get involved turns the police brutality into a spectator sport, harkening back to gladiatorial entertainment, which is updated in this scene by a bloody boxing match. By this point, and with the assistance of Gore Vidal's observations, the vision of the sequence has turned much darker. The spectators are in a frenzy, some taking great delight in the idea of one man pounding another. The piazza as a place of violence and of civil conflict has a long and ugly history within Italy. A site of fear under fascism, of violence against workers in the early 1960s, and of the Piazza Fontana bombing in 1969. Again, Fellini's film is not devoid of political innuendo. Ego and machismo rule the night, reversing tendencies earlier in the film. The camera is stolen, presumably eliminating the instrument that has provided a sense of well-being and undemanding participation in this communal celebration. However, since we are still watching the film, the camera has only occasionally and perhaps never been the recording device that has made the film possible. It has instead been modeling a way of being in the world, a mise en abîme of what Fellini's and Rotunno's camera has been trying to accomplish. We seem to be moving to another dead end. All the energy of the evening has been expended, and the festive music has dwindled to the mournful sound of a flute. Arrivederci Roma, which we will shortly hear, seems an appropriate swan song. There is nothing left to see except the proliferation of campaign posters that have all evening proclaimed the irrelevance of formal politics to Roman life. However, we encounter Anna Magnani, a major figure of Italian post-war cinema, as well as winner of an Academy Award for Hollywood's The Rose Tattoo. This will be her final screen appearance, as she will die 2 years later. She was Mama Roma in Pasolini's film of the same name, and she becomes the final dark-haired woman subject to monumentalizing, the final attempt of the film to fashion some sort of connection between the city and the feminine. Magnani rejects the narrator's attempt to turn her into a symbol of Rome, addresses him as Federi, and shuts the door in his face. Another dead end, another inaccessible woman turned away, as it were, another object or goal unattained, but also healthy renunciation of the film's tendency towards symbolic simplification. While Fellini has just sought to stop Magnani in more ways than one, he now relinquishes control, giving himself and the film over to something that presents itself as unstoppable. The epiphany of motorcycles recalls moments in 8½, and the Clowns, when the frustration of desire narrowly conceived, in particular filmmaking, leads to an experience of fulfillment beyond all expectation. For Fellini, the magical is just another aspect of the city about which the film has shown us so much. He has said, quote, "Suddenly an explosion of light will illuminate the battered space, and if you are not frightened, you will experience a widening of consciousness. It is a unique experience, a Roman experience," unquote. The motorcyclists seem to offer Fellini a new way of approaching his beloved city. The ballet encompasses the principal monuments of Rome, fusing space and time, past and present, humanity and technology, as Fellini makes some peace with modernity. It models found documentary, the cyclists just happen on the scene, and scripted, directed fiction, their movement is clearly choreographed, and conjoins uniformity, helmets and shared activity, with individuality. Each cyclist is distinguishable from the others. In contrast to the Trattoria and Trastevere sequences, being together does not mean stasis, but a movable feast. There is not a single still image for the final 3½ minutes of the film. The result is a relentless unsettling of the city as everything is and recontextualized. One thing becomes another, without interruption or conclusion. The movie ends, but the cyclist's motion, as we see it, does not. The brilliance of this sequence prompted noted French filmmaker Alain Resnais to exclaim, quote, "Nothing like it has ever been seen in the cinema," unquote. Whenever I see this sequence, I'm reminded of words from Tom Gunn's 1957 poem, On the Move. Quote, "A minute holds them who have come to go, the self-defined astride the created will. They burst away, the towns they travel through are home for neither bird nor holiness, for birds and saints complete their purposes. At worst, one is in motion, and at best reaching no absolute in which to rest. One is always nearer by not keeping still," unquote. I think Gunn is a bit more optimistic than Fellini. The ballet is both utopic and dystopic. In addition to the positive qualities noted above, The cyclists evoke comparison with the Vandals and Visigoths who sacked the Eternal City. Their uniformity and motorbikes recall fascists from other Fellini films. Their helmets even recall the cops who just beat up on the hippies. The Via Cristoforo Colombo, on which they exit, might imply the movement toward a new world. On the other hand, the road leads to the EUR district of Rome, planned by the fascists as a monument to their power. One thing the ballet has in its favor is a much more dynamic relationship to the Colosseum than Fellini managed in the traffic jam sequence. As the bikers exit the city and head off on the Via Cristoforo Colombo, it is well past midnight. We might surmise that we are getting close to dawn. However, the dawn has not arrived, and as Roma comes to an end, we are left with the open-ended, metaphorical question: are we moving toward the light of a new day, or merely continuing a journey in the dark?